Welcome to tonight's Voices of Discovery presentation. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to please silence all electronic devices and to please stay seated through the talk and a brief question and answer session that follows. Please feel free to use the microphones that are located in the aisle so that our speaker and everyone present can hear your question. My name is Elisa Bell, and I'm a junior environmental studies student here at Elon University. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our Voices of Discovery presentation tonight, given by Dr. Timon McPhearson. Dr. Timon McPhearson is an associate professor of urban ecology and director of the Urban Systems Lab and a faculty at the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New York School in New York City. He is a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the Sixth Assessment Report chapter on adaptation pathways in cities and human segments. Dr. McPhearson is also a senior research fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and associate research fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center. He studies the ecology in, of, and for cities to advance resilience, sustainability, and justice. He co-leads the U.S. National Science Foundation Sustainability Research Network in the U.S. and Latin America, the Enable Project in Europe, and teaches courses on urban resilience, urban ecological, technological systems, and nature-based solutions. Dr. Timon McPhearson teaches, researches, and engages communities through an interdisciplinary lens that focuses on understanding and ultimately improving the social equity, sustainability, and resilience of urban environments. More specifically, his scholarship addresses the interconnectedness of social, technological, and ecological systems in urban environments. He leads the climate change and urban resilience work at the Urban Systems Lab, funded by the National Science Foundation, the Prestige Foundation, and the City of New York. A prolific scholar, Dr. McPhearson has written for several books, including The Sustainability in America's Cities, Urban Planet, and contributed to the development of a virtual magazine and sharing platform called The Nature of Cities. In 2019, he will be awarded both the Sustainability Science Award and the Innovation in Sustainability Science Award by the Ecological Society of America. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Timon McPhearson.
Thank you, everyone, and I want to thank Elon, but especially my host, Robert, and all the other faculty that have done a lot of work to bring me here, and I really appreciate the efforts that you've been making. It's been a wonderful day talking with students and faculty, but let's get started. We live on an urban planet. In the last 150 years, the human enterprise on this planet has made this planet feel much smaller. It has fundamentally altered the biogeochemical cycles, it has fundamentally altered the biodiversity, it has fundamentally altered the climate. And so part of what we've been trying to understand as part of our work, and some of it documented in this book, which is open access and free to download, and has been downloaded about 75,000 times so far, is what is the nature of the urban planet? Why do we even call it that? This is what I want to talk to you a little bit tonight. And part of the reason for that is I'm going to show you here in a few minutes. But fundamentally, we've been working as a human society in a way that has been having some unintended consequences. And what I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit is what are the ways we can start to harness the sort of good intentions that we have in many ways, but to direct us on a pathway that is more sustainable and more resilient. So if we look back just in the recent history, the last 50 to 60 years, we can see some examples of this. In 1950, for example, the urban population was less than 1 billion on the planet. The urban contribution to the global economy was around $3 trillion. And if we fast forward 60 years, just into 2010, we'd see that the economy rose by an order of magnitude in terms of the amount of the global economy that is basically running through cities. At the same time, the population has expanded dramatically, population tripled. If we now just jump even a much smaller jump, just to 2030, we see a dramatic shift again, where the economy triples in a 20-year period, where the population nearly doubles. This is why we're talking about the planet as an urban planet. We are in a different paradigm now than we have ever been in the million-year history of humans as a species on the planet, and that is because of the rise of cities. And so this is part of the argument I'm going to make, is that it's twofold. That when we look at what we could call the great urban acceleration on the planet, that the global environmental changes, many of which we're very concerned about, and that we're trying to find a way to solve, if we would pose them as problems, are both driven by the nature of what happens in cities and solvable by shifting the way that we develop, plan, and design our cities. So this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Up here you see, if you look at the top of the screen, and there's a few small text here, so I'll read it out for you, is the rise of the global urban population, the expansion of the number of cities, the expansion of the land area of cities, which is tripling at the rate of the number of cities. So cities are actually growing broader and wider and taking up much more land area. And this is why they're driving resource consumption, energy use, and a number of other major trends. So these are just coincident trends, not sort of describing causality here, rather just to show you, if you think about the resource consumption that is happening in cities where the majority of people live, that's driving steel consumption patterns, that's driving energy use, that's driving cement to build new roads, new buildings, new bridges, new tunnels. And if you actually look at where we're headed in terms of cities by 2050, that the amount of infrastructure investment is on the order of $90 trillion that will be built for the future of cities. So we have an opportunity. Do we do things like we have been doing? Do we take the sort of urban development model that has been pretty much going on around the world since the 1950s, or do we shift that trajectory and fundamentally design our cities in a different way? And so what we'll talk a little bit about is this, that cities are the problem, and cities are also the solution. And this is why I'm working, why I developed the Urban Systems Lab, why I'm working in cities as an urban ecologist by training, but thinking about how we think about the ecology of cities as a system. And so cities here, just as an example of some of the things that were highlighted in the UN Climate Action Summit, that was just a couple weeks ago in New York. Cities are 60% of global CO2 emissions. So if we want to think about solving climate change, we've got to think about solving it with the power of cities to change their carbon footprint on the planet. Cities are using the vast majority of global energy use. So if we're thinking about where does all of that carbon come from in terms of the fossil fuel basis for most of urban development around the planet, this is an opportunity to shift that development pathway. One of the driving paradigms for sort of city solutions on the planet is smart cities. And I want to make the argument that we have to make our smart cities smarter. Right now, smart city initiatives are driven primarily by technology, and that technology is mostly through IoT and other kinds of initiatives, ways to monitor and tweak the sort of building performance. And so that's good for meeting certain sustainability targets, that's good for meeting efficiency and optimization, but that doesn't talk about justice, about social equity, that isn't explicitly about climate change in any way. It has very little to do with biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis that one could easily argue I think we're in, and we can talk about that maybe a bit more later. So we want to think about how do we advance smart cities when these are the most of the cities on the planet. Most of our cities aren't like where I'm at in New York City. Most of the cities aren't like Raleigh or Durham or other places. When you look around the planet, cities are complex systems. They're very complex. They're very hard to think about how do you shift the trajectory of a city. They're complicated systems. They're congested systems. They're contested spaces. And so some of the hard work, and I'll give you a few examples of this, and I won't suggest that it's easy work, is to think about how do we understand this complexity and the complexity of New York and the complexity of rural towns that are connected and teleconnected to the large urban agglomerations that are expanding rapidly on the planet. So I'm going to cover 6 major areas tonight, hopefully briefly, before people get too tired. I want to talk about how do we think about the complexity of the urban system. What do we mean when we talk about sustainability and resilience? What does climate change have to do with this? Why am I working so much on it in my group and my collaborators at multiple research universities around the world? What does that have to do with environmental justice? And then where are some of the new tools in our toolkit for both understanding the nature of cities and what they do so that we can think about how we shift that trajectory? And then those tools I'm going to talk about in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning, advanced modeling, some of the new computational abilities that will allow us to do things we've never been able to do, not even 5 years ago. Some of the big data opportunities that give us much more knowledge about both our own impact on the environments that we live and work in, but also how those cities are changing dynamically in real time. And lastly, about how do we communicate this, how do we influence decision making. And I'm going to put most of this in the context of shifting planning and policy. So let's start with the first piece. Cities are complex. If you look at the interdisciplinary scholarship of the last 2 decades, we could say there's been some pretty major advances of bringing the social sciences and the biophysical sciences together. That's largely happened within the concept of something we might call socio-ecological systems. I'm going to test and see if this works. It does. Okay. That's about a 20-year history of, I think, some very formative and important scholarship. This has been the backbone of urban ecology, my home discipline, the ecology work that's happened in cities, the development of the ecology of cities, the sort of more recent development of an applied science, what we call an ecology for and with cities. And that's already come out of socio-ecological systems. In parallel, socio-technical systems is a whole other stream of interdisciplinary work that's really been about bringing engineers and social sciences together to think about how do you take engineered systems, built systems, and make them perform better to meet the basic services that people have needs for. But these have been very siloed. So one of the things we've been doing to bring these together, both conceptually and theoretically, is to say that now is the time to think more holistically about how a system works, to bring decades of work on complex adaptive systems, on chaos theory, a lot of mathematical work into bringing these disciplines together and to develop what we're calling socio-ecological technological systems. It seems like a minor thing. It's actually not a minor thing because of the way it's building a more holistic urban science. And that's basically my goal with collaborators around the world, is to develop a new urban system science, one that takes into learning from urban design, from architecture, from planning, from policy, from ecology, from climate change. We can't actually work in silos anymore. Our universities can't work in silos anymore. Our government can't work in silos anymore. It's not working. And so we need both a conceptual approach to understand the nature of the urban challenge, and that's what we're calling SETs, or the socio-ecological technological systems. And those, you could call this something else. You could put a different label on it. But the point is that in the social, economic, biophysical, ecological, and technological infrastructural domain, broadly we conceptualize the major things that are happening in the urban environment, and frankly in a non-urban environment as well. So this is our starting point. How can we at least conceptualize the nature of a complex system like New York City? And that's a place I'll use as examples today, primarily, with a few other ones. We've been working in about 25 cities around the world. A number of things I'll show you are from US and Latin American cities today. But if you think about systems, if you've studied systems theory or looked at systems thinking, or go back to like Donella Meadows' book on systems thinking, it's not so much about understanding the biophysical systems, though that's critical science. It's not so much about understanding the nature of human behavior and perception, though that's really important social science. It's about the interactions. It's about the fact that every single thing that's happening in the city is part of a set of system interactions and relationships that are dynamically feedbacking on each other. And if we're going to shift the trajectory of the nature of urban development so that it's on a more sustainable pathway, so we build resilience to climate driven extreme events, then we actually have to understand those interactions. And that's what this is really about. So that was the first point. Sustainability and resilience. These two concepts are being bandied about as if they're the same thing. So there's a sustainability plan, you could just call it a resilience plan, or any given city has now decided to relabel most of their work. Sustainability was the buzzword of the last 10 years, now resilience is the buzzword of the next 10. They're not the same thing. And if we're going to think about how we shift from the past to the present, from the present to the future, and we're thinking about these normative concepts, like we want a more just world. We want one where income inequality is not so vast. We want a world that's more sustainable, that we're living within our environmental footprint on the planet. We want one where we can adapt to the climate change because some of that is already built in, and adaptation is key. We can't sort of pretend that we're just going to somehow decrease all the climate change. How do we get from here to there, and there being a place that's sustainable and resilient? And I'm saying and because they're not the same thing. And I want to give you a couple examples of why, and why this is important to have clarity around how we talk about these things so that we can work on these things. So first of all, sustainability. Sustainability has almost become synonymous with efficiency. if you think about the major sustainability initiatives, they have a lot to do about efficiency and optimization. How do you use less resources? You pack a bunch of people in the city, you put them in high-rise buildings, and now you gain efficiency because of the scale of that, right? Economies of scale. You use economies of scale as a way to bring efficiency. Now you're using less resources, the smaller total footprint, less energy, more sustainable, right? Resilience is in some ways the opposite of that. So I'll show you some examples from Hurricane Sandy in New York City, but just to give you a prelude to that, cascade of failures. Energy systems went down, transportation systems went down, communication systems went down. If you look at resilience theory, one of the fundamental components of resilience is redundancy. It's the opposite of efficiency, right? So when I say we can't talk about these as if they're the same thing, it's because to do that actually masks understanding of what actually we need to do to be resilient to climate change in a coastal city like New York with sea level rise, for example. Another example, cities by nature of this sort of optimization of resources, by economies of scale that have actually driven the nature of urban agglomerations on the planet. Why do people move to cities? For jobs, for resources, for services. Why is that happening? And we're going to have 70% of the urban population by 2050 in cities. Why does over 80% of Americans live in cities and 50% of that is on the coast? Pretty obvious reasons, really good reasons for moving to a city. But the other thing that happens is that because of that, and this is just an example of Lower Manhattan here, you're packing in infrastructure and people, therefore you've just bumped up your vulnerability. Right? So a fundamental nature of urbanization is actually increasing vulnerability to, in this case I'm going to spend most of the time talking about climate-driven extreme events, where heat waves, coastal flooding, drought, and other similar type natural disasters are ones where cities become the locus for impact. And we're seeing that around the world, and I'll show you a couple examples in a minute. There's also trade-offs within resilience itself, and so I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more in questions, but this is another thing that is, when, for example, New York City is thinking about building, a giant sort of U-shaped barrier with all sorts of wonderful amenities and park space. It's going to be a beautiful, incredible thing around Lower Manhattan. When the water rises and the storm surge comes in, it's pretty basic hydrology to know the water's going to go somewhere. It doesn't just hit a wall and then go back out to the ocean, right? So if you do that, there's spatial trade-offs. What happens if you build resilience in one place, you're actually eroding it somewhere else, right? So we have to think about the larger system. The system's way of thinking about this hopefully lends some tools to this so that we don't make some pretty obvious mistakes in the way we're investing to adapt to climate change. Another is thinking about what kinds of resilience are we talking about. A lot of the investments in resilience are really to protect infrastructure. They're largely technologically driven solutions to protect infrastructure. Does that protect people? Are those the same thing? And in a lot of cases we can say, no, that's not true. In a number of places, what we're going to be doing by ways in which we might reinforce protection for critical infrastructure that's high value from an economic perspective is likely to reinforce status quo, to exclude certain populations. And by reinforce the status quo, I mean reinforce the status quo of long-term structural racism and social inequities that are pretty much the hallmark of the nature of cities that we have. So this is a major challenge that we've been trying to work on within the urban system stuff. My last point on this is just to sort of give you just a sort of graph version to examine this. If you just think about this really simply, right? Low sustainability to higher sustainability. That's a sort of normative goal. And lower general resilience to higher general resilience. You can start to think about where we get these trade-offs. These are the places where more sustainability, high efficiency systems, optimized systems, everything's working perfectly until the natural disaster comes in, and then you have a cascade of failures because you didn't have that optimization where you really want to be more in this space. And so how do we do that? This is some parts where we can think about it theoretically, we can think about it in practice in particular examples, and this is part where there's still a lot of experimentation to do to really figure out where the sweet spot is here. And hopefully some of the examples I'll show you will give you a few ideas. So just to kind of sum up that point, I think this is something we have to get right. We need to be clear about our language, clear about our definitions. And the reason isn't because this is heuristics or because this is a linguistics. This is because in order to operationalize ideas and put them into practice, we need to figure out where those trade-offs are and try to minimize those. And actually to think about where the sweet spots for synergies are between sustainability initiatives and resilience initiatives and invest in those. And we're not going to really be able to do that unless we can talk clearly about what our goals are. And this is because we're thinking about how do we actually apply these in policy and planning and practice. I guess my sort of hypothesis for the rest of the talk is that systems approaches, advanced capabilities we have to really understand, monitor, and evaluate will help us with this sort of planning and policy agenda. So this is going to be the section I'm going to spend the most time on, is to talk about climate change and what it means when we think about risk and climate change, increasing risk to climate-driven extreme events, and who is affected by that. And the argument I'm going to make here is that we've had a number of environmental justice challenges in urban environments and non-urban environments. We think about the history of the environmental justice movement. It's largely been about pollution and about the siting of certain segments of our population in the more polluted environments. And I think the nature of environmental justice is shifting. Climate change risk is the new environmental justice challenge that we have, and it's not going anywhere soon. And so this is one of the reasons why we want to spend some time thinking about this. And the backdrop for this is two major concepts that if you think about those big curves, right, that are shifting, one of those big curves is a change in the climate that goes along with the change in urbanization. And one way of maybe articulating this is to say these happen to be happening at a moment in time where they're on a direct collision course. And it's partly because of what I talked about in terms of the concentration of infrastructure and people in harm's way. It's also the way in which there's a feedback system here, where the nature of the way we build, plan, and design our cities is driving the climate to change, and that climate is then impacting our cities. And so we have to think about how we intervene in that feedback loop to change this collision course. The fundamental question here is, what is our future really like? And we don't know. You know, the sort of wonderful opportunity here is that the future is uncertain, which means we can shift that path, right? But I'm just going to talk about this question right in this space here, in sort of the present and near-term future. These are models from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So moving farther into the future, and as you can see, as you move farther into the future, the error bars essentially get really wide because we don't know what the future is going to look like in 2300, but we can model out different scenarios. But this is the question. Is the on average, global average temperature rise going to be 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius, 3, 4 degrees Celsius? Because the implications of those small changes, what seem like small changes, in average global temperatures is going to affect everything about what we have to plan for and what we have to build policy for and what our targets really need to be. Last year, the IPCC put out what we call the 1.5 degree report. Today, with some of the students and faculty, we were talking about the land report that just came out a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I think. The latest update on oceans, all of which were sobering, I think. This one was too, and it's interesting because if you think about the Paris Agreement, and I'm going to make a few assumptions which might be unfair, but that you have some familiarity with the conversation here, that the nations came together a few years ago, they formed the Paris Agreement, the nations have all signed on, and there are certain targets that are with the goals to limit global average climate change to 1.5 degrees. That's the goal, right? So this report, the scientific community was charged to produce this to understand what would it mean if we achieved that goal, and what would it mean if we don't achieve that goal. What's the difference between something as small, on average, as 0.5 degree Celsius of warming? And in the middle here is a comparison of that. And broadly, what we know is that if you warm it a little bit, things change pretty rapidly, especially when you look at ecosystems and the sort of magnitude of loss you expect with warming for lots of reasons. The way in which sensitive ocean species, a small temperature change, a small salinity change, a small pH change actually wipes out lots of species, and coral reefs and things are already at risk. The bottom line here is really simple. It's that 1.5 degree target is very important for us to try to hit. And this will get a little bit lighter later in the talk, but I'm going to just put a little realism here because we're going to talk about resilience a little bit more, and broadly, if this helps with the language here, think about it as climate change adaptation. How do we adapt to the resilience to climate change? If you add up all of the Paris agreements, if we are optimistic and every nation achieves what they said they would do for reducing carbon emissions to hold climate on that target to 1.5 degrees, they actually add up to 2.7 to a 3-degree world. That's actually what the pledges add up to. So despite having a goal, if you add up all the national pledges, the future that we're looking at is not 1.5 or 2 degree or 2.5 degree. It's closer to a 3-degree world. And keep in mind that these kinds of projections come out of very conservative models. So one thing we've been noticing, and scientists do this on purpose, is to be very conservative about our projections, right? And so the IPCC's pretty conservative projections, they get updated with every assessment cycle. This is what we're working on right now for the 6th assessment cycle that'll come out in 2022. That we find each time that the climate's changing faster than we thought. So, if I want to think about how to make sure New York City is resilient to what's coming, my precautionary principle would be that we need to plan for greater than 3-degree world. So just to put that 1.5, 2-degree slide in context, I do that so that we can kind of really think, where are we headed? And it's not necessarily to scare anyone. It's to say that if we want to think about adapting to a changing climate future and we want to build resilience, what are we actually building for? How high do the seawalls need to be if we're thinking about sea level rise in coastal cities? What is the heat future that we need to prepare for? And we've got to figure out how to better cool our cities because of the way in which they trap heat and create an urban heat island. And if we're not actually having a serious conversation that is based in the realism of the path we're currently on, then I think it's hard for us to actually plan appropriately. On the other hand, this is a future context, and it does mean that we can shift things. This is some work also looking at future context. All of that is very broad. It's like a global average. You can't plan for a global average, it turns out. It doesn't really mean anything about sea level rise in New York City, which happens to be in the North Atlantic and happens to be rising much faster than most other places around the world. It's not like the ocean is actually as flat as you think, right? It varies. And so it's rising faster in certain areas. So this is just an example. We did this work with NASA and our team. We published this last year as part of the 2nd assessment report on climate change in cities. What we found, you don't need to read into this, so don't squint. All you have to see is the gray and the black bars. And you can see that there's 0 exceptions. Every city gets hotter. The other point that comes out of this is not only does every city get hotter under these climate scenarios, and what we've done is downscale them to the city region so you actually have a target to plan for. It's not some global mean that you have to imagine. It's actually new science that is showing the downscaled regional projections so that you have your own target for your own city. So this has been done in this report larger now for 100 cities, and that's expanding. So this is another example of how the science is shifting in order to provide better information for planning and policy. The other major point here, which you can't see, is that on average, the cities are getting warmer at double the rate of the global mean. That's the nature of cities in some ways, but interestingly, this doesn't capture the urban heat island effect. So this is a conservative estimate for how hot cities may get on average in terms of their warming. I'll show you some examples to explain this in a few minutes. But I just want to sort of underline that that's a future context, but the present context is one that we're already dealing with. So, if you're skeptical of understanding from various climate change models what the future is, we can also just document the present. And by documenting the present, one thing we see is that for pretty much every category of natural disasters, we've got some serious things to deal with. We developed the most comprehensive database for natural disasters in New York City. This is work we've just published recently in Climatic Change with one of my former postdocs. And what we found is a couple things. One is there's been a lot of natural disasters over the history of the last 140 years. We've seen that this is rising in the near term, but more importantly, we're trying to understand what does New York City need to worry about, because it's not as if the future is completely new, it's also a product of what our regional weather systems do. And we know that in our case that we really need to be working on urban flooding and extreme heat. But it also allowed us to ask the question, for whom? For what? A lot of our focus since Hurricane Sandy, which is in 2012, has been around protecting infrastructure because of the massive amount of economic loss there. On the other hand, if you look at the history of lives that are affected by extreme events, you see a very different picture, which is that we have to be working on heat probably much more than we thought. And this is a past context, not even a future context yet. I'm going to show you just a couple things. This is New York City. This blue spot, this is a surface temperature map, is Central Park. Staten Island has a lot of green space, so it's got a lot of cooler space. But I want you to look at some of the red zones. Here in the South Bronx, so I'll orient you really fast. Staten Island, Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn. The South Bronx and sort of central Brooklyn. They're kind of red on this map. I'll show you some other ones that are a little better to show this. If you also look, where are the high concentrations of African Americans living in New York City? They're mostly concentrated. You can't really tell super well from this map, so I'll show you a better example. But these are pretty hot areas with current temperature. They're the same areas, different maps, we'll orient a little bit differently. Central Park, Brooklyn, South Bronx, Harlem, North Manhattan. These are the places that also where the highest concentration of residents lack air conditioning. A different challenge, totally related challenge, right? If we zoom into the Bronx, these are the hottest parcels. Now, the subtext here is that this information has never been available before. The ability to actually look at temperature at very high resolutions. You can not just figure out what neighborhood you need to be working in, what block you need to work on, what building you need to be working on, so that you can target investments in a place where they can have the most impact. But you see a similar pattern to what I was showing at the broad scale, but now you can kind of see it here a little bit more. We're looking at where the very hottest places, these are the coolest are in green, hottest in purple, and where the highest populations of some of the most sensitive populations to keep are for many other reasons I can talk about. If we look at the future context, the New York City Panel on Climate Change was convened by Mayor Bloomberg. It was the first city panel that was created to use the resources we have in New York City because we have NASA, because we have one of the major global climate models there in New York City. We can kind of harness that to produce information for New York City. It's a special benefit of that. And one of the things that they've gone so far as to do is to look at the future of heat waves and suggest that if we don't change our city in the way that we're planning in our city, that we may actually have some mass mortality events. And this was a bit of a wake-up call to think about the way in which the city was unprepared for Hurricane Sandy, and that we may be very unprepared for this situation as well. And to me, this is very useful because it says if we do our job right, this won't happen. And so how do we do our job to prevent this and to prepare the city? This is why we've been both documenting the past to understand the fact that heat waves are already increasing over the recent past in the city. It's also why we've helped write and advise as part of the Mayor's Task Force on the Urban Heat Island in New York City, the Cool Neighborhoods NYC report. This is a $100 million effort to invest in heat resiliency in New York City. That's a pretty good start. But if you actually look at the challenge of what it takes to make a city cooler, I would suggest this is a drop in the bucket. To actually build climate resiliency in cities, not just New York City, but other places, is going to require some pretty massive investment. But it's a good start, and it's why we've been working really hard closely with the city to provide the science for the decision making. It's not just about heat. I am going to show you a couple maps, but hopefully you're oriented to New York. It's about other things. And so coming back to the environmental justice question, what we see when we start to map where is the highest heat areas, where is the most inland flooding happening, where is coastal flooded areas most at risk, is that we see similar populations at risk to all of these events. That it's the low-income and minority populations repeatedly that are being affected by these events. So to me, there's an underlying question that we have to be not just asking, but finding the solution to, which is how do we protect the most vulnerable populations that are sort of, once again, facing these kinds of risks over and over. On the other hand, the ability to think about that solution space is also driven by advances in technology. So I'm not digging into the method side of it very much, but for anyone who does any kind of spatial work, you might notice the resolution here is that we're at parcel scale resolution for mapping the multiple hazards to think about how do you invest in green roofs or other kinds of green infrastructure to cool the city that can also absorb stormwater and reduce both flooding and heat challenges, and where would you target those to benefit which populations are most at risk. This is the way that spatial planning can be advanced, and urban planning is in a paradigm of spatial planning. That is the nature of the way urban planning works now. And so this kind of information is changing the ability of how we can plan better and target our resources for most impact. A couple examples. I just show these just to kind of to give a sense, but also some things that we learned after Hurricane Sandy, which was pretty dramatic. $90 million lost in the region, about 20 of that was in New York City, and those are the kinds of numbers that people like to talk about because they have big economic impacts. On the other hand, 200,000 cars were lost like that. That affected people's lives. That's a loss for a lot of people. Hundreds of thousands of homes were affected. And so when we're thinking about how do we build resilience, it's not a conceptual idea. It's not theory. This is about trying to prevent the impact of these disasters and the magnitude of these disasters. And that's a pretty tall order for any city. When Hurricane Harvey hit in Texas, this was a wake-up call for New York because we haven't had this kind of extreme rainfall. That actually spurred a major investment to understand how we can start to think about this. We've been so focused on coastal flood impacts in New York since Sandy. But this is happening around the world, and I can show you slide after slide after slide, the way in which this rise of extreme events is impacting urban areas and causing pretty dramatic impacts. But the underlying point I wanted to make just for this section of the talk is that when we look at where these impacts are happening and likely to happen, we see, to orient you again, here's East Harlem. East Harlem is an area with, that we've been working in for years. It's an area with high asthma rates, high obesity rates, a number of public health issues. It's an area with people with predisposed sensitivity to heat. It's an area with some of the hottest areas in the city, so you may not have recognized in the maps I pointed out, but it's one of those hot spots. And it's also the place where 100 and 500-year flood events are going to have massive impact because it's low lying and there's no real coastal protection there. So again, this is where multiple kinds of hazards are putting the same neighborhoods, the same populations at risk. And on the one hand, this is sobering, and on the other hand, this is the kind of information that can help our decision makers and put it in a very simple way of visualizing it, so we can say, this is the place to focus in infrastructure investments. So I want to talk about some of the advances in the science that are allowing us to advance planning in a way that we haven't been able to do that before. One of the things we're trying to do, and this is a bit of a tall order, but I'll just give you an example of broadly how this works, is to build, I don't know how to say this exactly, but to build the most complex model of an urban system ever. So why would I want to do that? Well, the reason is really simple. It's that going back to that system nature of things, if we can't understand the system, how do we think we're going to be able to shift it when you've got all these unintended consequences and feedbacks? And it's not to say we're ever going to be able to model all of reality. On the other hand, we have never been in a place before with this amount of information and the computational ability to bring these pieces together. So for example, I'll show you some examples here in a minute of how we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to learn from the past to build both near-term projections as a basis for a more realistic scenario of what the future is likely to look like, how we're bringing that in together with new ways to actually not just downscale heat to the regional scale, which is what I showed you, but to the level of those others where we can really target which streets under what scenarios are the ones that are going to be the hottest that we need to actually target our interventions. Where should we plant trees? We can tell you that now, for example. How do we start to bring that into urban and coastal flood models, to looking at the social demographic models to understand vulnerable populations? How do we bring this all into a large modeling environment to help improve decision making? So a couple examples we were thinking about, for example, on the heat side, this is a place, better go faster. This is a place where I'm feeling kind of excited about what we've been able to do here, which is, and this is published and peer-reviewed in a number of places, but to start to be able to project the future of heat under, you pick your scenario, we can do that. We're using some standard scenarios from these global circulation models in terms of building the scenarios, but how we can actually start to spatially project at very high resolution where heat is likely to be higher. Now, why is this useful? Yes, the points I've already made about prioritizing interventions, but it's also useful because when we chain this with other models, we can start to evaluate interventions. Will they cool as much as we want them to? Will they cool at the level that brings that total temperature down in the neighborhood? How does that scale to the larger city or borough within New York City? And so two sort of take-home points is that in the near term, this is a medium path projection, not a high heat scenario, sort of middle path, and I can tell you more about that if you want to. In these two, in the 2020s and 2050 scenarios, you see the same kinds of distributions where certain areas get hotter than others. That's helpful for thinking about where we need to target our interventions, especially when you overlay social vulnerability maps on them. The other thing that kind of stands out is the 2080 map where it starts not mattering anymore. It's just hot everywhere. And what you can't see up here is the temperatures. They're in Celsius anyway. I sort of refuse to switch to Fahrenheit for being a true scientist. But I can explain it. The 2080 map essentially means that a heat wave today is the average day in the future. And so this is a bit sobering too, to think about what do we need to do to shift our trajectories now, because that future is pretty dramatic. If 90 degrees is our average heat wave day in New York City, if that becomes the average summer day, then we have to live differently in the city, and we have to invest differently. And again, this is about realism. This is about understanding what do we actually need to build our cities to perform at what level. Looking at storms, I mentioned Hurricane Harvey. When all that rain landed in Texas, New York City thought, what if that happens here? In Hurricane Sandy, we didn't have much rain. It was mostly coastal storm surge that pushed water into the city. We didn't really have a lot of rainfall. If we had had rainfall, it would have been a much different story. And so we've been working with the city and with Brooklyn College and Stevens Institute and a sort of consortium to develop storm scenarios to really look at what are sort of chronic to extreme rain events, how do you combine that with coastal storm to build a whole suite of scenarios to try to understand where will water come and under what conditions will it, so that we can understand where do we invest, in this case, similar to the heat problem, to start to look at the likely water distribution and where infrastructure people are going to be affected. So this has been building and working to build some of the latest software out there that's coupled hydraulic and hydrologic models. These two models allow us to look at above ground flow and below ground flow to bring the whole sewer system and all that data online and start to compute this. The reason I'm mentioning this isn't just to back up similar points, is that this is something that would never have been possible 5 years ago. And definitely never 10 years ago. And that's because we're running on 10,000 GPUs in the cloud to process billions and billions of data points to produce maps like this, where we can actually build a decision support environment where we can run, say, a high rainfall scenario that might be different from another scenario. We can layer them on top. We can move around the city and ask, how deep is the water? What is the flow rate? How long will it take for it to dissipate? How long is it going to be standing in that area? And other kinds of questions. This allows us to then overlay that with critical infrastructure and to say, where are the hospitals, where are the schools, where are the fire departments? Are they in places that are likely to be flooded under a scenario? That means over the next however many years, we need to move them. Our emergency response areas, we've already found from some of this analysis, shows up for emergency response, some of our emergency response stations are in high flooded areas. Didn't really know that, so we would get more sophisticated about these kinds of models. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and I'm going to go through this part really quickly. The machine learning part of this is allowing us to use historical analysis and to build artificial intelligence to learn from recent past, now that that data is starting to accumulate, and we can see what is the likely transition state in any part of the city, in any neighborhood, to some other state, and how we can use that to predict the near term and then build on top of that other kinds of scenarios. And so I'll jump to an example, and I'm happy to answer questions about this. There's a lot of different kinds of inputs that go into this. This is only possible because of advances in data and higher resolution data that not just New York City has. This is an example actually from San Juan, Puerto Rico. We're doing this work with Valdivia, Chile, and Hermosillo, Mexico, for example. But what we're able to do is to say, okay, let's take the kinds of changes that have been happening over the last 20 years in San Juan, Puerto Rico. If you run that, you can kind of figure out what that trajectory looks like. This is a business as usual scenario. I'm not going to explain all the parts here because I just want to show you the contrast with other visions, other ways our future might look. The red is urban areas, the green is shimmer like wetlands and forests, just for context. We've been also asking residents, bringing diverse stakeholders together, whether it's our work in Harlem or whether it's our work in Puerto Rico, or we're asking them, so you want a more resilient future, what does it look like? And people have different ideas about that. They have different strategies about that. And part of the freedom of thinking a little bit long-term is to say, let's put our politics aside, let's not worry how much it's going to cost yet. Let's just try to figure out, if we want a better future, what does it look like? Do you want more affordable housing? Do you want food security? Should we be thinking about coastal retreat from low-lying coastal areas? In this case, this is a food security map where people around the table are drawing out and saying, we want more urban agriculture in this area, we got to fix our transportation networks, this is a good place for growing food. And then what would happen if you bring that qualitative visioning exercise into a quantitative environment? And how does your vision and my vision, if they're different, what do they mean when it comes to actually looking at resilience? So I'll just give you a couple quick examples. This is that business as usual. We look at their food and energy security, we bring it into that quantitative environment. We can start to compare and contrast how different San Juan might be in 2080 versus coastal flood resilience, where they're moving the urban populations away from the coast, protecting wetlands. This is a major sort of conservation plan to a place that's really focused on connectivity and transportation networks. And as abstract as this seems, and I know it probably does for a minute, I want to show you why we're doing this. We're doing this so if we're thinking about flood resilience in San Juan after Hurricane Maria devastated that island, then we need to know which of these visions is going to do a better job at both providing more affordable housing and providing urban agriculture, but also building flood resilience. And when we do that, we can start to evaluate. If you just look at the blue, light blue versus dark blue, you can see that on the x-axis, on the bottom, some of those scenarios do a better job of coastal of flood risk protection than others. And so it's not about who's right or who's wrong. It's about evaluating the trade-offs between different visions and using the new quantitative environment to really start to understand what strategies work well, and then we can work backwards and to say, since we run these models every single year, all the way up to 2080, what do we need to do in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, to be on that pathway? And so these last bits are just a couple slides I'm going to finish up here to say that this is all requiring data. All these kinds of new techniques only happen with advances in data. And that's changing. The data landscape is changing really fast. The big data landscape is changing fast. Some of the reviews we've done on what's possible with the changing data landscape are out there, and we might call it that there's actually a real data revolution, and this is partly why we can start to advance planning and policy with information we've never had before. On the other hand, science tends to lag behind the private sector. Science tends not to quite be up to speed with, for example, commercial and industry. And so this is something that we're trying to work on. How do we bring the science along much faster in terms of being able to use the kinds of data streams that are usually only available in the private sector? We can start asking questions we've never been able to ask before because of the advent of data. And we can talk some more about this. And an example from social media data on the last slide to the way in which sensors are being deployed across cities and not just cities. And this IoT, this Internet of Things, is driving a whole new data revolution in terms of information about our environment in a way that didn't run like it should have. In a way that we can start to build software that allows us to understand and evaluate and monitor the performance of any investment that we might have. So the last piece I'll just mention is none of this is very useful if we can't communicate it well. Science tends to be kind of poor at this in general, and so this is why a third of our group in the lab are designers and data visualization experts to help us think about how we communicate. And so we've been trying to work on this. How do we build decision support tools so that we can bring really complex models, even complex things to talk about, like some of what I talked about is kind of hard to get it all out and explain it, and do it in a way that's easy for a decision maker to go, I get it, that's a place that needs investment, and this one we can wait a little bit on. That's how I can prioritize. So we built the what we call the USL Data Visualization Platform. You can check this out at UX at urbansystemcloud.com. This is live, open access for 9 cities in the US and Latin America right now. It allows us to layer information, to look at heat risk, to look at the current state of heat, to look at the future heat modeling, and bring it into a very simple environment that's intuitive and easy to operate. To layer over things like social demographic information, to look at vulnerable populations, Or if you notice, this is layered into the building, so you can ask the question, which buildings are at risk, and how do we prioritize for those investments? This is an example from New York, but like I said, this is up and running for small cities that you might think are data poor, but they're not. We're actually starting to build data sets for cities because of what we know is out there and how we can start to bring this online. And so these kinds of tools are, I think, some of the advances in tools in our toolkit to start to think about how do we move from the present to an Anthropocene, I use this word very much, but human-dominated planet, an urban planet, but one that is good. How do we shift our trajectory? And part of it is having a vision for what is good. Part of it is understanding that challenge, and how we can actually start to shift that trajectory is knowing where to invest and to get the most out of our investments, because no matter where you go, there's limited money. The other part, as I mentioned, is to have a positive vision. The news is dominated by dystopian narratives of our future. I like to read science fiction. Most of it's pretty depressing. But it's also because this is the way we tend to think about our future. And there's no way we're going to get to a 2050 that's better or 2080 that's better if we don't have something positive to plan for. And so that's why we're doing things that are difficult, like bringing diverse stakeholders together around the table, in some cases to talk to each other for the first time, to say, what is your vision of the future? Let's evaluate that, and let's figure out how we can move together on that pathway. For example, using something like nature-based solutions, which is using ecological infrastructure in cities to help deal with the climate problem, something the UN Convention on Biological Diversity has said might be 30% of our solution. Right? How do we do that? How do we have a vision for that? That's some of the work we're trying to do in the lab, to both to plant seeds of what is a good Anthropocene in the present, and think about how we can leverage those, scale those, and expand those to achieve that better future that we're all trying to get to. Thank you. I think I'm allowed to take questions, so I know we started a little bit late and we're moving a little bit late on time, so. Tell me when I should stop.
Are you allowed to answer questions?
I am allowed.
Yes. Just wanted to make sure. So my question has more to do with the politics of the whole situation.
Sure.
Because as you mentioned, you're bringing together a whole bunch of diverse stakeholders, sometimes even places like Puerto Rico, which have a completely different political climate than we do. So I suppose my question is, how do you weigh the different priorities that all these people are bringing to the table? Because you wanted to bring together both social justice, environmental justice, but also take into account the fact that there are, economic stakeholders here that have economic interest versus social and environmental. So how do you just bring that all together without having to line each other's throats?
Yeah, well, fights do happen. So, part of this is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's not like something I was trained to do. I'm still very uncomfortable in some of the situations sometimes. But especially in these scenario development and visioning exercises where we're working with diverse stakeholders, they often don't agree. And one of the ways we approach this is say, your job is not to agree. Your job is to get your ideas out there and to be part of the conversation. And so our goal is not to get consensus. Now, ultimately, someone needs to make a decision about this investment or that investment or this strategy, right? But we're more brokers in terms of bringing communities together and saying this is what we can do on the science side to advance the science. And so I think the short answer is we don't have a solution for how to broker really diverse politics. What we do try to do is create a safe place where, and there's facilitators that we train to try to figure out how to handle these situations when they happen, is how do you make sure people are allowed to have a voice? How do you make sure that people normally who don't have a voice get a chance to speak? What are the rules of engagement that everyone needs to abide by? And if you don't agree, that's okay. And I think especially when we're thinking about visions of the future, that having many visions is much better. There is no one future we're all headed towards, right? Maybe in 2080 you can describe the present moment for a second and describe what it is, but it's constantly dynamic and changing. And so when we think about pathways to the future, there's so many pathways. So on the one hand, like almost all the good ideas are good ideas, right? Say that all good ideas. Some judgment in there somewhere. And so I think what we're trying to do is encourage inclusion of voices that are normally not heard, and that is kind of its own challenge. But not to champion any particular politics, and to create a place where people feel like they can at least have a conversation. And that's not going to solve or change the whole world, but it is a start. Thank you.
I thought this was great because it really wasn't political. And you did say that one of the key points is communication. And just being aware of what the possibilities are. How can this be communicated or plan to communicate it to Charleston? Or, there's so many cities that would be concerned. And just to be aware of what's available and without even making decisions, but just saying, wow, these are the possibilities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's one of our challenges, is how do you kind of get the word out about what information you could have at your fingertips? I don't have an easy solution to that. I think a lot of this is this kind of gathering where we can have a conversation and we can show a few things. It's why we're working in lots of different places, and so we're trying to scale up our ability to work in different cities around the world. But there are thousands of cities. I mean, there really are. I mean, you didn't realize that. There's thousands of cities on the planet, and there's more and more happening all the time. So there actually isn't any sort of silver bullet that I know of to how you sort of raise the knowledge level sort of quickly across this. I think, though, on the other hand, there are mechanisms where cities are learning from each other. And so whether these are big groups like ICLE, which has 1,500 cities as part of its network, the Local Governments for Sustainability group that's been around for a really long time globally, where their networks talk to each other, or it's in the US, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, where the sustainability directors from over 200 cities in the US are talking to each other on a regular basis and build an organization for sharing information. These are conduits, and we partner with USDN in particular, so that we can help say this is what we can do, this is how we can help. But there are a number of networks that are growing to do this. The National Science Foundation I was talking earlier just invested in a major network just to share about what's working and not working on what we call nature-based solutions, which are generally the benefits of ecosystems in cities for people, and the solution side of this is generally focused on climate change adaptation, resilience. And now the U.S. National Science Foundation is invested in building a global network of networks, where we're gathering all the networks that have their own institutions that are working on it, and we're bringing those networks together to create a broad knowledge-sharing platform that's global in nature. So there's a number of mechanisms that are some very well established and other new ones that are forming, and I think that's going to get us partly there. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Question, what kind of educational backgrounds and professions are in short supply to help scale up and do some of the things you're talking about?
So in this particular area that I'm talking about, there's a lot of need. Well, I could talk about a number of things, but we'll just focus on this. Data engineers, data scientists, people with strong computational ability. For everything I've talked about, we rely on coders, on actual data engineers, on people who can start to navigate the cloud. It's not a straightforward thing to have a sensor on the ground that speaks seamlessly with some receiving device in the cloud that allows data that you can easily pull down that's clean and analyzable, right? This is an entire data engineering project. And then the fact that the data is expanding so massively, something like working with social media data, like Twitter data, these are billions of points, right? So you have to have a comfort with that. And this is where the data science comes in. So analytical abilities, spatial modeling and spatial analysis, data engineering, data science, these relatively technical things, if people have technical ability, there's going to be jobs in every sector. There already are, and they're growing very, very rapidly in the private sector, in the government sector, and the academic sector. Even for ecologists.
Let us give our speaker another